Hey everyone, welcome back to the OnScript podcast. This is Matt Lynch coming to you from Regent College in Vancouver. This is a re-release of an episode we released about 2 years ago, and it was one that I wanted to listen to again, and I thought you might as well. So we hope you enjoy this re-released episode with Philip Ziegler, and as always, we appreciate you listening, and if you'd like to share the word, please do so. Thanks so much.
Hello, OnScript listeners. This is Erin Heim coming to you from Wycliffe Hall in Oxford, where I am a tutor in biblical studies. Our guest today is Professor Philip Ziegler, whose book, Militant Grace, tackles foundational questions resulting from what he calls the apocalyptic turn in Christian theology. Now, Phil's book encompasses a dizzying array of Christian theologians, from Luther and Calvin to Kierkegaard and Barth and Bonhoeffer, and somehow he even manages to be conversant with biblical scholars like Ernst Käsemann and J. Lewis Martyn and John Barclay and Beverly Gaventa. Phil, we are really delighted that you could join us today. Welcome to OnScript.
It's an absolute pleasure to be with you.
So off the bat, it's important to define the terms of our discussion, especially since a term like apocalyptic is, as I've actually said before on our podcast, a nebulous term, even among its adherents, and it's a downright contentious term in some circles. So, Phil, what do you mean by apocalyptic?
Sure. Yeah, you're certainly right about that. For purposes of the book, I've taken the term apocalyptic up as a term of art, as I found it used by a collection of Pauline scholars, some of whom you've named, Beverly Gaventa, Lou Martyn, and others, who have found it a useful term to capture something fundamental about the nature of Paul's witness to the gospel. And I understand, as you say, that in biblical studies, the use of that term is a hotly contested thing, whether it applies best and only to the genre of writings or a genre of ancient writings, or whether or not it can be used in the way that they use it. I'm quite happy to sit reasonably light on that. I find it useful as a term to capture something which I'm sure theologically we could find other words for. I mean, you could use the word eschatological to express much of what's here, but there's a kind of forcefulness to the term apocalyptic, which I find helpful, and an evocation of something of the character of the events that are at stake in what Paul wants to say about the nature of God's saving activity in Jesus Christ that I find useful. It's an evocative term. It is a little unnerving, which is also not a bad thing at the start of a conversation. It invites the question, what are you possibly talking about? And that at least is a question which we can follow on from. So in other conversations I've had, I've been happy to sort of say that if there were other language that were possible to express as concisely as the term apocalyptic does what's going on here, I'd be happy to use them, and so I'm not wedded to it as a kind of essential piece of language, but I do find it very, very helpful, and for just those kinds of reasons that it draws attention to something fundamental about what Paul is saying and doing with the gospel, and it's a hook on which I can hang the number of specifically theological aspects about his witness, which I find are so important for my own thinking theologically at the minute.
Sure, and that's exactly what you're trying to do in this book, is to hang various other aspects of Christian doctrine on this apocalyptic framework that, as you say, is a useful way of describing Paul's version of the gospel. And I think that's exactly how I've heard Beverly and John Barclay use that term, that it's not necessarily one wedded to genre, but it's one that they find useful as a theological concept to encompass what Paul is doing. I think Douglas...
Yeah, just so.
Yeah, go ahead.
Just so. No, I was going to say, I mean, it's to take it as a synonym, which of course it is even in translation, of the term revelation, is exactly right. And what it allows me to lift up from Paul and then to think about theologically is the character of that revelation as both a disclosure, true, but even more fundamentally an event that affects and determines the nature of reality itself. So it's the language of Revelation tends to tip towards the epistemic side, which is of course integral to what's at stake here. But even more fundamentally, I think for Paul is the thought that the revelation of God in Jesus Christ is an event which changes everything, an event around which time and space, the cosmos itself, turns. Right? And so it's the eventful character of that, the reality determining character of that event, the effectiveness of that event. All of those things, I think, can be expressed under the rubric of revelation, obviously. But the language of apocalyptic really helps to bring that out, right? Whatever else an apocalypse is, it's something that makes something happen, right? It's a happening, an occurrence. So that particular piece of the meaning of the word, I find extraordinarily helpful.
Yeah, I think that's a helpful distinction too, to distinguish the event that then determines epistemology and everything else from just a category of epistemology where we somehow realize something that was always there. That's definitely not the focus of an apocalyptic theology. Is that fair to say?
Yeah. Yes, for sure. Yeah. The other language which I've sort of imagined you could use is you could put this whole thing under the rubric of Advent, right? The arrival of God, the coming of God, the appearance of God. I mean, all of those terms are ones which I would think are in the kind of cloud, the linguistic conceptual cloud that I'm trying to use the word apocalyptic here to capture, and they all have that force of the arrival of something new and unheard of that changes the circumstance in which we find ourselves. And whatever else Paul thinks about the gospel, I think he certainly thinks that.
And you write about this apocalyptic turn and you speak about it with a great deal of conviction. So how did you get interested in the apocalyptic turn, and why do you think that this issue, this framework, is such an essential one, perhaps the essential one for Christian theology?
Sure. So my own kind of encounter with it, I suppose, feels a bit happenstance. I hadn't really come across it as a student in theology in Toronto, where I did all of my work in the 1990s. But I spent a year at the University in Princeton at the Center for the Study of Religion on a postdoctoral placement in 2001, 2002. The purpose of my time there was to write a series of papers on Paul Lehmann, the theological ethicist who had taught for a time at a number of places, Harvard, Princeton, and also at Union in his later days. And while I was there, his papers were deposited in the seminary archive relatively recently, and I was working through his literary legacy there. I was keen to meet people who knew him, and in the course of encountering these people around in the northeast part of the U.S. there, I met, among others, Christopher Morse, who at that point was still professor of theology at Union Seminary, who had been very, very close to Lehmann. And Christopher is a very hospitable guy. Everyone who knows him will know what I mean. He was keen not only to kind of speak to me about Lehmann, but also to be sure that I met other people who knew him. And so he and I traveled up on the train to New Haven one afternoon to meet Dorothy and Lou Martyn, who were living there in their retirement at that point. And Lou, as other guests you've had in the past have told you stories about one of Lou's great gifts was to connect people who he thought needed to be together. And so after I had met him, I had a series of other people kind of contact me saying, Lou Martyn said we have to get together and talk, including Beverly and Susan Eastman and others. And so those kind of personal contacts have been a way in which I've been led into the discussion in that particular way. I think materially, what caught my eye about it initially was the way in which it suggests that there's a way of understanding Paul that puts the radicality of divine grace at the very heart of the matter again. And this, from my theological point of view, was an extraordinary, exciting proposition. And the way in which it does that, of course, was new to me. All the sort of interest in the cosmological and the turning of the ages and the three-agent drama, the sort of features that are the hallmarks of a lot of that scholarship, These were novelties to me, things I was excited to get my head around, to sort of contemplate. And the more that I did that, the more I found that this idiom really did help to communicate the force of Paul's understanding of grace and its radicality in a way that other ways of speaking about these matters that I had kind of acquired through the years and had become commonplace for me were unable to do. And so the wager of the book, kind of as it's emerged over a decade, essentially, has been a series of attempts to think about what it might look like to take systematic theological responsibility for these kinds of developments in Pauline studies. And I suppose part of the essential character of that, or why it's sort of a burden that I felt needed to be picked up, is that Protestant theology in particular, I'm coming to the Reformed side of the Christian tradition, Protestant theology in particular is exposed, I think in a particularly strong way, to developments in understanding Paul, right? I mean, some of the basic convictions at the root of those traditions in their distinctiveness, understandings of grace and faith and justification and election and so on, sort of Paul's suite of soteriological convictions and commitments, those categories are particularly exposed to changes in the way that we read Paul, right? And whatever else Protestant theology is, I suppose, in my view, it's the kind of theology that wants to hear Paul aright. Not only Paul, clearly, but with a particular kind of intensity, Paul. And so the thought that these sorts of developments in Pauline exegesis put real pressure on the traditional ways of thinking and speaking about soteriological matters in particular seemed to me something that really just couldn't be bypassed, right? And so the work that's gathered together in the book is essentially my attempt just to think through some of that pressure and to try to think about and to explore what might happen if we took this way of reading Paul seriously. What kinds of things might we need to say differently about our understanding of salvation, about the nature of Jesus Christ, about our understanding of space and time, so on. So to kind of trace out the doctrinal consequences of an adjusted or a revolutionized, perhaps, depending on your point of view, reading of Paul. So I think that's kind of where it comes from in human terms as well. But materially, it's theology's exposure, in particular, to the importance of Paul's witness to the soteriological core of Christian faith that I suppose made it unavoidable for me, at least as a theological thinker, to work with this new understanding of Paul in this way. I might say also that, as I noted in the introduction, we struck up a group of us that met for, and still does, around the edges of the ARSBL from time to time, explorations in theology and apocalyptic. And one of the things that was exciting about that for me was it put kind of biblically minded theologians and theologically minded biblical studies people together to talk in a way that I really covet and which I hadn't been all that good at cultivating before that. And the opportunity to think about these things collectively and in a collaborative way has been one of the real both delightful and important aspects of this work for me. So the book is really, I mean, it's got my name on the front, but it really does reflect a series of insights which have been won from a decade's worth of corporate conversation. So I'm grateful to that group in particular and the people who've been involved in it over the years for their stimulation and provocation, for sure.
And what a neat project to be a part of. And one of the reasons that I was so excited about your book is that attention to not only these, I mean, as you say, the influence of Paul on these obviously massively influential Protestant thinkers, going back obviously, millennia at this point. But also your careful attention to what's actually happening in Paul's writings themselves, and I attribute that to your skill as a theologian who's attuned, but also to, yes, as you say in this introduction, it's very clear that these theological ideas have been carefully cultivated in close conversation with biblical scholars. And I think likewise, when I read someone like Beverly Gaventa or Susan Eastman or John Barclay, you see the influence of good theologians and sound theological thinking. So I personally, as a young scholar who kind of came up with J. Lewis Martyn being my hero that I've never met, and Beverly Gaventa being someone who I can look at her writings and say these are the reasons that I'm excited about biblical studies, and it's precisely because they seem to pay such close attention to the theological implications of their exegesis. So I want to say thank you for just the careful work of a group like that, and it's clearly evident in this book too.
Oh, well, that's very kind. The benefit for me of thinking in running conversation with the kinds of New Testament scholars whose names you've mentioned there has been essentially to be taken back to school on the importance of Paul in particular, but the Bible more generally for the work of doing Christian dogmatics. There are all kinds of ways, of course, in which one could conceive the task of thinking doctrinally, and the idea that that doctrinal reflection must be riveted to the Bible, and looking to refresh and renew itself by that consistent, fresh exposure is something that this whole endeavor has sort of convinced me of again, if I had lost that sensibility previously. I should say, I do feel that I'm sort of reaching outside my comfort zone in a lot of places here. I as anyone does in a extended theological education, had a fair amount of training in the biblical study side of things, but I don't count myself an exegete of any significance whatsoever, and so I realize that I'm particularly reliant on the scholarship of others. But that seems to be the way that things both kind of can and ought to be done, right? So it's been a great joy to have had my theological thinking kind of pulled back into proximity with the Bible and kind of held there in a way that I'd like to think would be a mark of the rest of my work going forward as well.
So what I didn't mention in our introduction is that Philip actually has a long pedigree in theology. He holds, I think I counted 5 degrees total or something like that, from the University of Toronto, University of St. Michael's College, then Victoria University, University of Toronto some more. And you're also ordained to the Order of Ministry in the United Church in Canada. And you were a junior fellow then at Massey College, and you did, as you mentioned, this postdoc at Princeton before you taught, I think, a stint at Atlantic School of Theology, and then you finally have migrated to the University of Aberdeen, where you now hold a personal chair in Christian Dogmatics. That's a pretty illustrious career path. So what set you on this path in the first place to becoming a professional theologian?
That's interesting. I didn't imagine that this was my vocational direction of travel when I got to the end of my high school studies. I started my university work actually at the Royal Military College in Canada, which is the sort of equivalent. It's a tri-service college, a bit like West Point for all 3 services. And I was training to be an artillery officer and studying English as my degree. A couple of years into the program, I realized I had made a kind of vocational error of a significant size, and so left that program and moved sideways to finish my undergraduate studies in what I thought was to be English literature at the University of Toronto. It turned out that transferring to the University of Toronto was a complicated business, and it was easier for me to finish in religious studies than it was in English. So that's what I did, in part because I was excited to go there for 2 reasons. One was to have the chance to be close to Emmanuel College and the Toronto School of Theology more generally, which is where I subsequently went on to do my theological training, but just to be there as an undergraduate, to be close to that and to get a chance to suss out what was going on there and what kind of educational opportunities there were, because at that point I was working through our church's discernment processes for ministry. And then also to have a chance to take the undergraduate courses that the literary critic Northrop Frye was teaching still at that point in Toronto on the Bible and Western culture. These were famous courses, and I had read Northrop Frye's work, The Great Code, and related works as a teenager, and had been really struck by his sense of how lively and important the Bible was for just understanding the cultural world in which we lived. And I was excited to be able to take those courses with him. Those courses were actually taught as religious studies courses, and so that's partially why I ended up following that route. But at the end of that degree, I had discerned a call to ministry in the United Church of Canada, and so I stayed on at Emmanuel College there and pursued the MDiv degree with that pastoral horizon in mind. One of the things about the Toronto School of Theology is the scale of it, sort of 7 or 8 colleges all in a federation, this ecumenical kind of melting pot. It was a fabulous place to study when I was there. And you could also combine academic study and pastoral training. So I did a joint MA MDiv because I was interested in the intellectual side of the Christian tradition, and I wasn't quite sure, which of those trajectories I might be better suited to make a contribution to. And so I did those 2 degrees in joint, thinking by the time I get to the end, I'll know which way this is going to break. And I didn't know when I got to the end, so I just kept going. I had opportunities to carry on to do my PhD work in Toronto, and I did that. David Dempson, they're one of my primary supervisors. John Webster and George Schnurr were also teaching there at the time, and they're so fabulous teachers and very encouraging folks. And I did a project there on the East German theologian Wolf Krutke, who was a living theologian at the time I was writing. He had been one of the leading figures in the East German theological community during the communist period. And I was intrigued by what had happened to Protestant theology, the kind of developments that Protestant theology had undergone under those conditions of radical, aggressive secularization. The thought being that the kinds of lessons that had been learned in that context under immense secular pressure might be of real value to those of us who were thinking and pastoring in a place like Canada, where concern about secularization as the horizon of church life was a real thing. So that project was a great one. I enjoyed it a lot. And then I had the chance to pursue this postdoctoral placement, as I mentioned, in Princeton. And the interest in Paul Lehmann was related to my sort of interest in Christianity and public life. So in fact, the grant program that took me there was a series of funded postdocs on public theology in America was the rubric that the funding was under. And so I was reading Lehmann with a view to the way that theology engages with public issues and takes responsibility for public matters. He was a sort of theological ethicist with a particular interest in the political and the wider world. The chance to teach at AST consolidated both my ecumenical interests, and then also there too, a very small department. I think by the time I joined the staff, we were 7 or 8, and so you had both lots of scope to teach because lots of things needed doing, and you were there, and so you did them. But it also meant that we worked very closely together with colleagues in other subdisciplines. You couldn't afford to be precious about that, and so lots of very happy and fruitful encounters with New Testament colleagues, people working in related kinds of fields. So I like to think that my interest in the keeping the proximity of biblical study and theology together emerged in part from that time in Halifax. And it's certainly been a feature here in Aberdeen over the years too. We've had New Testament scholars here who have been interested in the theological in ways that have been very open. Francis Watson was on the staff when I joined and was my original mentor here. And theologically too, the people who I have and continue to work with here are also very interested in that conversation. So yeah, it's been a good environment to work in. I feel really blessed by all of that.
And if a lot of our OnScript listeners are either students in theological education of some stage, or they are early career People kind of like me, I guess we're the podcast generations. But if you had one piece of advice to give people who are starting out, what words of wisdom would you have?
Oh, that's tricky. A single piece of advice. Chase the questions you love. It's a real privilege to have time and space to think about these sorts of matters of real, even ultimate concern. And there's a whole lot about life that conspires to crowd that out. And so to the extent that you find yourself given opportunities by virtue of being enrolled in programs or engaged in conversations with colleagues, or the opportunity to pursue study or reflective opportunities, to really identify and to dig in on the questions that really animate you in your own theological reflection, you should really take those up. They're fleeting opportunities often, and they are really pressurized increasingly. So it's university life, just like parish life, does a lot to crowd out, perhaps surprisingly, space for reflective thought, and so trying to find ways to get elbow room to continue that, and being willing to stick with the questions that really animate you. I mean, there's lots of interesting questions out there in the world, but if you find a channel of thinking that you really find you're convinced is important and fruitful, whether for your ministry or for your teaching or for some combination of the two, being able to sort of hoe that row, as they say over here in Britain, at length and patiently, is a real is something well worth doing for sure.
So let's get back to the book then. In the opening sentences of this book, as we've already talked about, you point to J. Lewis Martyn as sort of a preeminent figure in the apocalyptic turn. Obviously, not only in biblical studies, but as you've shown in theology. So what impact has J. Lewis Martyn had, help me understand as a biblical scholar, on theology in particular?
Sure. So let me speak just for me. I think the ideas that come from Lew's work that have been most important for me theologically are the way in which his interpretation of Paul draws attention to a number of features of Paul's gospel, which are of decisive importance for the content of Christian doctrine and also the form of its presentation. So, for instance, one of the things that Lew draws attention to time and time again in his readings of Paul is the way that Paul construes of the business of salvation as what he calls a three-agent drama. Right. So it's typical for us to think of the work of salvation as a transaction between God and the human creature, a kind of two-agent drama. Two players on this stage. God's doing something, humans are doing something, and whatever you want to say about the outworking of salvation, it has those two agencies involved. Okay. There's much, of course, to recommend about that. Lew's suggestion, though, that we don't do justice to Paul's account of the gospel if we don't see him telling a story in which not only two agents are involved in the business of salvation, but a third agent, and a third agent whose role is much more fundamental than you might have imagined, and that, of course, is the sort of the role of the inimical powers. Lew tends to call them the anti-God powers, sometimes with capitals. There's a kind of Pauline triumvirate of sin, death, and the devil. Right? That I use that sometimes in the book as a shorthand for this suite of sort of inimical powers. The idea that the agency of those powers and their enmity, both vis-a-vis God and therefore vis-a-vis God's good creatures, is baked into the understanding of the gospel in a way that such that if we don't do justice to it theologically, we're simply not doing justice to Paul's witness. That had never really struck me with the force that it has since my sort of encounter with Lew's work. And trying to take responsibility for that particular insight is no easy thing. I mean, of course, there's lots of theological discourse in the tradition about the role of the devil and other kinds of things. Of course, the devil's not a particularly it's not a particular theme which is highly amenable to modern sensibilities. So it raises all kinds of really interesting and frankly quite tricky theological questions about what it would mean to talk about this third agent clearly, responsibly. I mean, both, and by responsibly there, I mean on one hand responsible to the biblical witness and its sort of the contours of its witness to these powers, and then also to think responsibly about how those powers figure in a wider understanding of Christian doctrine and testimony. So that the three agent drama feature is one of the things which I think has really put pressure on me personally, and I think others too, to think about or to change the way we think theologically about the business of salvation.
Sure.
One of the things that means. Yep, please go on.
And I just wanted to interject there. He has this phrase that you pick up that fits pretty well with the this idea of three agents, that the world has been twice invaded. And that's a pretty important foundational piece of the framework that you're laying out in the book. So I wondered if you could talk about what you mean, and maybe what Martyn means when he says that the world has been twice invaded in relation to these anti-God powers and the three-agent drama.
Yeah, good. So the world as such, the product of divine creation, has a history. So one of the things that Lou's account of Paul suggests is that we don't think of the world quite properly with Paul unless we think of it in this historicized way. There's a story to tell about the world, and that story includes two moments of catastrophic intervention. The first is the eruption of sin into the world, and sin here is understood not so much as the kind of moral turpitude of individual human beings, or even human beings taken in their collectivity, but as a power external to human beings to which they succumb. Right, and that's why, in terms of the grammar with which it's spoken of, sin, death, and the devil keep close company in Paul's work. Right, sin is a kind of agent, external to the human being, an agent whose power is such that the human being cannot, on its own terms, resist that power. A power that literally invades the creation. It doesn't belong there, right? It's not part of the good creation. It's alien. It's properly alien to it. It has no proper place. It's not to be kind of reasoned with or accommodated or rationalized. And its structure is sheer negativity, right? It's profoundly inimical to the goodness of God and to the goodness of God's creatures and their flourishing. So that invasion remakes the world, as Lou puts it, right, in sort of one stage. He then speaks about Paul's understanding of what God does in Jesus Christ as a second invasion. So this language of invasion he's fond of it. What it's trying to capture then again is that the outworking of saving grace in Jesus Christ is not a kind of natural emergence from the flow of history. It doesn't just kind of happen as a result of the imminent processes of the unfolding of things, but rather God arrives on the scene, as it were, in a new and unanticipated way in Jesus Christ to again, his language, you find it in Kesamon, to reclaim that creation which has been falsely lorded over by sin. And so you can hear already in his idiom the kind of martial metaphors that are so common here. One of the things that does, I think, theologically for us is it helps us to rethink again the way we think about sin. This idea of sin as an inimical power, a third thing, which is not just the kind of consequences of human finitude and folly, though no doubt those things are weaponized by sin, to be sure. But sin as a genuinely third and in some ways utterly alien agent in the midst of the creation. It puts themes like lordship on the table again, right? One of Kesamon's great questions, who is the Lord of this world? So the thought that there's a contest going on between this kind of the usurpacious power of sin and the rightful lordship of God, and that the human creature is whatever it is in the midst of that struggle, right? And that the business of divine salvation is to redeem, to liberate creatures out from under the lordship of sin, the false lordship of sin, and to restore them to the proper lordship of the God who is their creator, redeemer, and savior. So that way of thinking, it puts the motifs of redemption and liberation at the front of the way we think about soteriology. There's a chapter in the book which concentrates on that and suggests that you can think about reconciliation as a moment internal to this wider account of redemption, so that we don't have to lose sight of themes of guilt and forgiveness and whatnot, but that the major motif, the kind of leading and coordinating motif, is in fact redemption out from under the usurpacious lordship of sin. That for me has been one of the really exciting bits of sort of Lew's theological consequences. And again, those themes have been they've been at work in the tradition, of course, over time, and so they're not sheer novelties. But the way that Lew and those who are thinking in and around that apocalyptic reading of Paul come on to Paul is that they really do help to bring those themes to the surface as ones which in my mind require important theological reception, and then sort of the consequences of that reception lead us in all kinds of interesting and I hope fruitful directions in rethinking and republishing the basic shape of the Christian message.
So if I can play devil's advocate for just a minute then, given that we're talking about sin, death, and the devil, hopefully I don't embody those things all the time, but maybe just right for this minute. And I ask this question because I am drawn to apocalyptic theology, and I presented a paper that gave a fairly apocalyptic reading of a passage in Galatians, and one of the members of my seminar and friend, Murray Ray, said, I think this is an interesting reading, but I have a problem with this language of invasion and battle, because it makes it sound like there was a time when God somehow lost his sovereignty and wasn't actually sovereign over his creation. So I have a problem with this because it sounds like he's coming to creation that was not somehow already his. So how do we answer that objection in a way that does justice to other texts where we don't necessarily find the militant language that we do in, say, Galatians?
Yeah. No, sure. So that, of course, is that's a genuine and a very apt theological consideration. Let me take a step back and I'll come at the question like this. So one of the things that I think this way of reading Paul requires us to ask is what kind of dualists Christians have to be. And this question, in the way that Murray put it to you, helps us to clarify one of the kinds of dualists which we're not to be. And that is this way of reading Paul does not commit us to a kind of dualism of origin, or a kind of originary dualism that would pit sort of God and anti-God as two equivalent divine powers contesting over a creation or something. Yes, that's right. Yeah, we're not committed down that line. That's for sure. But what we are, I think, committed to is the view that in the midst of the good creation, over which God is properly provident, there is an inexplicable, uncoordinatable eruption of opposition to God, which runs and runs and runs. And why it runs is, I think, beyond the ken of faith. That it runs is both the witness of Scripture and, I think, something which, illumined by Scripture, we can read off our experience of the world in a certain sense as well. So that there is opposition to God in the world, and indeed in ourselves, that opposition is an object of God's concern, is an object of God's sovereignty for sure, but the mode of that sovereignty, the mode in which God seems to want to confront and to encounter that eruption of opposition, is precisely through the outworking of salvation in Christ in the way that we read. And so one of the consequences of this way of thinking for me has been to pull the doctrine of providence ever more closely to the doctrine of salvation itself. That we and that does put pressure on the doctrine of providence. I mean, it's not quite so easy as Murray's question suggests to say, kind of in a comfortable, untroubled way, that divine governance simply means that this sort of disruption at the heart of creation is not a real thing, or not something that needs to be taken seriously, or the kind of thing that one could be relaxed about, or what have you. There are a whole series of possibilities which are simply ruled out of bounds there. And that the mode of God's providence is best understood and illumined kind of reflexively from the way that salvation itself is worked out. So that we don't, the worry that we might be able to cultivate a kind of abstract account of providence, which floats relatively free of the way we understand salvation. That's part of what causes that disjunction. So I suppose for me, the idea of the discourse of invasion, of eruption, of advent even, right, that God kind of comes to the world in Jesus Christ, doesn't so much suggest absence as it suggests the effective appearance in time and space of the God who wills to save his good creation, to save the good creation, precisely by the overturning of this usurpacious power. That is the mode in which God provides, as it were, right? That the mode of divine governance is precisely the mode of salvation. So, yeah, I mean, Murray's point is a good one. There is a kind of dualism to which I think Christians are committed, and I'm not sure that we're committed to ascribe the work of sin in the world, or the work of sin, death, and the devil in our experience of faith, precisely because of its inimical character. We're not obliged to ascribe it to divine providence, right? I mean, I think it's entirely within our right, and indeed perhaps an obligation for Christians to confess that there are things that happen in the world which are simply not willed by God, right? That God has a will with reference to those things, but God's will with reference to those things is their contradiction, and that I know is there's much to think about there theologically, to be sure. But as a starting point, I think this understanding of Paul's gospel kind of has reawakened that sense that it's important for Christian theology to acknowledge the fact of that which God does not will in the midst of the world. Of course, how to think that through theologically, how to work it out doctrinally. But I think that's the burden that I think this work puts theologians like you and I under, and I think those are the right kind of problems to have, precisely because they're the problems that arise from taking this account of the gospel seriously.
Yeah, and I have to say that's one of the things that I'm most drawn to in terms of this apocalyptic framework, is that it actually gives you vocabulary to call evil evil, and we don't have to give an account, or at least this gives us a way of saying that there are things, working that out theologically is obviously more complicated, but there are things that are antithetical to the will of God. And pastorally and existentially, that's an important question. So if we change directions, really, actually 180 degrees, Phil, are you ready for your first speed round?
Oh gosh, okay. Bring it on.
Okay. They're off-the-wall questions. The rules are that you answer the first thing that comes into your head, and you don't have to give us any explanation for it, and there is no judgment no matter what you say. Okay, maybe there's some judgment on some questions, but not... Just kidding. Okay, so here we go. If you could be any animal in the world, what would you be?
A badger. You didn't see that coming. I know.
No, and I'm laughing because we had a close encounter with two badgers in our garden a couple of nights ago, and I didn't realize this, but when you get close to a badger, they hiss, and it's really unnerving. And I hope to never confront one again. So I put badgers in the category of sin, death, and the devil, but
Okay.
good for you. Oh, that's great. Okay. What is your favorite work of either fiction or nonfiction outside of theology?
Oh, that's interesting. I think one of my favorite fictional titles of all time is, well, what? I'm quite an avid reader, so there are lots of novels to which I'm devoted. I think I really enjoyed reading The Unbearable Lightness of Being by Milan Kundera. That was one of my first exposures to sort of European writing, and I found it very artful and just winsome and engaging, and I've enjoyed reading his work ever since. Yeah.
I think you can tell when people who write in theology are avid readers of like good fiction or nonfiction, because your writing in this book is exquisite, and I think you can tell when people are avid readers by how well they write in theology. So that's really encouraging. Okay. I've just moved, so I'm keen to get an immigrant perspective. What is the biggest adjustment that you faced when you moved from Canada to Scotland?
We were talking beforehand, actually. I think it's the scale of things here in the UK. Coming from Canada, everything is just a little bit bigger. Well, actually, quite a bit bigger. Distances are bigger. Kind of homes, cars, roads, sidewalks, everything just kind of that much larger. There's just that much more space. Life here has a kind of everything is close to one another in ways which are good, but also take some adjusting to. I think I was estimating when we were chatting before that the scale of life here is about 2/3 as big as everything back home. Well, one of the nice things about that is that, and this really has been a difference which I've appreciated, is that within 3 hours by train. Here, three and a half hours by train, there are 4 or 5 large theological faculties, St. Andrews, Edinburgh, Durham, Glasgow, and the opportunities for theological collaboration and conversation in this part of the world are really they're importantly augmented, and it's just so easy to get together to talk to people. That is a glorious thing. I mean, we loved our time in Halifax, but the distance between the seminary in Halifax and the other kinds of places where you might find people to talk to about your work, it took some doing, put it that way. The compaction of life here in Scotland has taken some adjusting to, but it's also been a blessing.
Yeah, I was thinking about that. I haven't driven our car since January, and everything takes less time to clean, but we also, because we have small children, have stuff just everywhere, and that's taken some getting used to.
Yeah. Could I venture just another one in case this is better as a reply to your question? The climate here in Scotland is obviously different than the one that I was accustomed to back home in Canada. This is a one coat climate. I literally wear the same jacket 12 months of the year, and it rarely gets below 0 for any length of time, and it rarely gets above 20 for any length of time. So we do have seasons, but without extremes, and that takes some getting used to as well. I'm not used to winter here yet. I grew up in Minnesota. We have winter there, and I had lots of coats. That's true. That's an apt one. Okay, what is something that you find embarrassing? Embarrassing. Doing these sorts of interviews, I suppose.
That was Susan Eastman's answer too.
Yeah. It's funny. You wouldn't think that someone kind of drawn vocationally to preaching and teaching would find public speaking embarrassing, but one does. One just does.
And then, do you have any hidden talents?
Hidden talents. Oh, goodness. I play a reasonably good recorder, and I'm not a bad euchre player.
Like more than hot cross buns, reasonably good recorder.
Yeah, for sure. What else? I learned how to curl when I was a student in school. Like an ice sheet curling. Yeah, other hidden talents.
The best Olympic sport.
Yes, it's a very fine thing, and one of the things that I didn't have to change my sensibilities about moving to Scotland either. Yeah, and I bake a mean apple crisp. How's that?
Oh, excellent. So let's talk about the second part of your book, which is longer than the first part of your book, because in the second part of your book, you're actually working out how this apocalyptic framework impinges, as you've said, on these various issues in theology. I think especially in terms of lordship, or those are the chapters that I found really helpful: lordship and salvation. And the second part you actually call Christ, Spirit, and Salvation in an Apocalyptic Key. And you focus on Christ's lordship in this threefold office of Christ, which is to say that you're talking about Christ's kingly reign, which you say is spiritual precisely because it's eschatological. So we have these three terms that we don't always see together. We have apocalyptic and spiritual and eschatological. What do you mean that Christ's reign has to be conceived spiritually because it's eschatological?
Yeah, good. Thanks for that. So those terms arise in that chapter as a result of the way in which reflection in the Protestant tradition, at least, on the nature of Christ's royal office has tended to use the word spiritual to characterize the nature of that office, the mode of that office. And the force of that language in the tradition is, I think, twofold. So one is that it's to differentiate it from earthly lordship, right? So Christ isn't just one political force among other political forces, right? So different in kind from earthly powers. That, I think, is a fundamentally important point to be made, and the language of spiritual helps to draw that distinction. So there's spiritual and earthly. The temptation, or one of the things that language is exposed to, though, is a misunderstanding that when you say spiritual, you mean unreal, so ineffective, right? Earthly political kings and monarchs and rulers get stuff done, but the spiritual lordship of Christ is a kind of hazy corona that floats over things, but without effect. And whatever the language of spiritual means, I'm keen for it not to have that kind of misunderstanding attached to it. So to call it eschatological is the way that I wanted to suggest that to speak about the lordship of Christ's lordship as spiritual is to suggest that it's manifest in the actual outworking of the work of the Holy Spirit in the world, and that work is eschatological in the sense that it's the pressing home of the finality of the gospel in the midst of lived existence. And so it's effective, right? I mean, that Christ's lordship isn't simply a kind of hazy corona, either floating above political events or, in the inner depths of my heart, which doesn't impinge on the nature of the course of affairs in the world. I mean, quite the opposite. The mode in which Christ's lordship impinges on the world is spiritual, in that it's worked out by the work of the Holy Spirit, in and beyond the scope of the church, in and beyond the scope of the Christian life. So it's spiritual in the sense that it's not earthly, not in competition, sort of equal competition with earthly powers, but sovereign over them. It's spiritual in the sense that it's the outworking, or it's worked out by virtue of the activity, the ongoing activity of the Holy Spirit. That also means that it's present, right? It's not just something which happened in the past. There was a time when Christ sort of acted royally, but now that we're not, that's not going on in the present. Quite the opposite. To call that lordship spiritual is one of the ways in which you speak about it as a present activity, that Christ is presently governing by way of the Spirit, as it were.
Sure, and then that bears directly on other doctrines, like our understanding of theological anthropology, because since to be human, as you say, and I'll quote you, is to have life in the body. As a creature of this world, it is to be irrevocably knit into the fabric of the world and always and everywhere subject to rule. So you've related Christ's dominion, and indeed sin's dominion, to anthropology. And I think that for me, at least, was a very helpful way of thinking about that. And then you have this other turn with this rule, this language of reign and rule. You say, basically, not only do we have these two possibilities of dominion, the false dominion of sin, and then the spiritual reign of Christ, but actually those two lords have kind of enlisted, to use the military term, their human subjects into their service. And you have this term for Christians who have been enlisted. You have this term, the church militant, which is, I'm assuming, where you get militant, or you're picking up militant grace. But that's an idiosyncratic term. What do you? And I have to say, one that I maybe struggle with as someone with Anabaptist tendencies. What do you mean by the church militant?
Sure. So the use of the word militant is an interesting and a dangerous choice of terms for reasons you've intimated. I think I'd like to say that the primary predicate of the adjective militant here, and in my thinking, is grace. So it's primarily a way of characterizing divine activity which is engaged, active, powerful, effective on behalf of its captured and captivated creature, precisely for the purposes of redemption, and that grace comes against all which is antithetical to it in the world. And so the militancy is a way of naming or calling out the shape of that divine activity as we witness it. To speak of the church militant, so in one sense, it's simply to use a very traditional term, which differentiates between the church triumphant, i.e. the church in eschatological kind of glory, and the church in its pilgrimage here. One could speak equally as well as of the church as the pilgrim church. I don't think these are contradictory descriptions whatsoever. The militancy of the church is whatever it means, it will mean in correspondence to the militancy of divine grace. So the kind of extraordinary power of self-giving, which is the basic form of divine activity. Likewise, the militant church is marked by a kind of surprising and surprisingly effective in the gift of the Spirit, powerful acts of self-giving, which win back, as it were, creatures from their captivity, are undertaken, actions which are undertaken in the service of attesting. So witness and testimony are important concepts, as you would have seen, attesting to that divine activity and serving it in the world. So proclamation and service are militant insofar as they're caught up in God's own militancy for the salvation, redemption, liberation, and restoration of the lost creature. The church, the part of the church's calling, kind of integral to the church's calling, is to be about its Lord's business, I suppose, to put it that way.
Oh.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's well said. And kind of to follow up on this, being about the Lord's business, one of my favorite chapters of the book, maybe because of my Anabaptist leanings, was your chapter on Thy Kingdom Come, in which you argue that to pray Thy Kingdom Come, that prayer must be understood eschatologically in order for it to be intelligible at all. And in your words, to pray Thy Kingdom Come faithfully means inhabiting an eschatological field shaped decisively by both Christological and apocalyptic coordinates, and that petitioning God in just this way is properly constitutive of the very fundamentals of the Christian faith. So why, Phil, is Thy Kingdom Come an essentially, fundamentally eschatological prayer?
So the coming of the kingdom, the advent of God's reign in and over the creation, is the horizon of all Christian hope. And the prominence of that theme in the Lord's Prayer is striking, actually, and not one which it's funny for all that of course it's a commonplace. It's perhaps because it's a commonplace that we sort of lose our alertness to just how extraordinary that claim is. I think I put at the head of that chapter that as an epigraph that passage from the Didache, which is also taken from one of the prayers from chapter 10 of the Didache, let grace come and let this world pass away. The prayer for the kingdom of God in the Lord's Prayer, I think, materially is identical to the force of that prayer from the Didache, or rather you might think of the Didache as offering a kind of expansive gloss on what it means to pray for the coming of the kingdom. Let this world pass away. This world being used in the very specifically Pauline sense of the world subject to the dominion of sin, death, and the devil. Let grace come. I mean, what it means to ask for the coming of grace. I don't think that we often appreciate how radical a transformation we really are inviting upon ourselves and upon the world in which we live when we utter such prayers. So the force of that chapter was to try to recollect precisely that the profound eschatological ambition, hope of that prayer, and to suggest that we don't pray it lightly. Right? It's and precisely perhaps because it's a sort of piece of the furniture in Christian worship and piety, our awareness of the radicality of that for which we ask here, I think is easily eclipsed. So yeah, the sort of ambition of that chapter was to try to surface that sensibility again for us. And to recommend that precisely because that prayer is a piece of the furniture, the suggestion there is that this kind of expectation, this kind of hope, this kind of longing, and the kind of life which is built in and around, arises from this kind of longing, is exactly the kind of life and hope and longing that should be the hallmark of the Christian life. Right? So that from its very beginning, everything else that Christians are about is undertaken kind of in and under the horizon of prayer for the coming of the kingdom of God, and hope for that coming. So the way that we orient ourselves in in everyday existence, the kind of ambitions we have for our responsibilities in the sphere of the family or politics or what have you, that all those things are what they are inside and on the basis of what is fundamentally an eschatological orientation towards the advent of the reign of God.
Yeah, and then you, and speaking of the Christian life, your third section of the book, you actually unpack some of how this kingdom ethic works out in an apocalyptic key again. So I wonder if we could just skip. I know there's a lot that we're skipping. OnScript listeners, I really would commend this. One of my other favorite chapters that we don't really have time to talk about because it's kind of it's a complex and very elegant argument is the chapter on T.F. Torrance and Paul Layman's view of natural law, which I found really interesting, especially since we're apparently 2 weeks from Brexit, and how just thinking through those questions, But Phil concludes his book with a chapter on discipleship. And in keeping with the rest of his book, he says that discipleship should be a distinctive evangelical militancy. So what kinds of things do you envision a disciple of the church militant, as you've just said, engaged in doing?
Sure. So I think the overarching thought that I have about the nature of discipleship is that it's primarily about the business of giving truthful Christian witness to the God apocalypsed in Jesus Christ. So not so much a question of doing the good as doing that which tells the truth about the God of the gospel and the world, which is the creation, the saved and redeemed creation of that God. And so I suppose it's the kinds of questions which I'm interested in thinking about, if we think about the basic Christian ethos as an ethos of discipleship, and we think of discipleship chiefly as trying to follow in the wake of that which God has done and is doing in the world, then the business of the Christian is chiefly to sort of to discern and to participate in or to act in ways which enact parables of that kingdom, right? To live in ways which conform and which tell the truth about the lordship of Christ, which, and therefore in their militant mode, testify against the falseness of the lordship of sin, death, and the devil in all of their concrete forms. Now, the difficulty, of course, is the move from the way I've just described it there, which is a reasonably sort of high-level summation, down to the details of that concrete discernment. But I think that's part of the business of Christian communities in their specific locations, about kind of individual Christian lives lived out here and not there and there, and the business of preaching. To be sure, the business of individual prayerful discernment. I mean, those are the sites where venturing concrete decisions about what manner of living today in this place, what way of disposing myself in the midst of this business discussion or that faculty meeting, God forbid, or this electoral cycle, or what have you, or in the face of this climate crisis, or all the pressing things of our age. What kind of way of being a human being here tells the truth about the lordship of Christ? Offers itself as an enactment of a parable of the kind of grace that has broken in upon the world, to break it open and to free it from precisely the kind of inimical, the structures of enmity, which are the sort of default options in the world governed by, as it were, sin, death, and the devil. The overcoming of enmity, Paul's, or pseudo-Paul, the language of Ephesians, the tearing down of the walls that divide. I mean, I think we're not left without direction, kind of signposts as to the shape of those activities, or their direction of travel. But the thing that I think this way of thinking has really enjoined upon me is the importance of that question of thinking about the Christian life as fundamentally parabolic. Right? We're not bringing in the kingdom. It's too late for that. That's God's about the business of bringing in the kingdom. The advent of God is precisely the context within which our own lives are to be set and understood, and our service to that, that for which we pray, the coming of the kingdom, is precisely to enact ever so human but genuine parables of the kingdom in all of the places where we actually find ourselves. And so that I myself, at least, have found that one of the real sort of profound upshots of this way of thinking, along with these readers of Paul, to sort of change the way that I think about the nature of Christian ethics, kind of as a discourse, but then more concretely, the shape of the Christian life. What kinds of ways, when I preach, for instance, what kinds of ways am I speaking about and encouraging people to reflect on and conceive of their own Christian existence in the world? Seems to me it makes a difference if we think of ourselves as trying to kind of achieve the good, or if we think of ourselves as trying to live in ways which tell the truth about the one who has made us his own, and whose lordship we endeavor to serve truthfully in the world. That way of the way we speak about the kind of fundamental language with which I want to talk about the Christian life has shifted over the course of this decade, in no small part under pressure from these kinds of ways of reading Paul. And I'm extraordinarily grateful for that, and I think that there's some real salutary elements in that kind of way of thinking about the Christian life. So
yeah, and I think I would just point out that as academically lucid as this book is, and it is that, it is also profoundly practical, and I appreciated so much that you ended with this exposition of Christian ethics, because it offers such a concrete challenge to the reader, to how we begin not only to think about Christian ethics, but actually to live as kingdom subjects. So, Phil, are you ready for our final speed round?
Most certainly.
Okay. More off-the-wall questions.
Okay.
Okay. Star Trek, Star Wars, or neither?
Oh, Star Trek, actually.
Oh, okay. What incredibly common thing have you never done?
What incredibly common thing have I never done? I've never swam more than 2 lengths of a swimming pool.
Oh, wow. And you live in Scotland.
Yeah. Yeah, it's dangerous. Very dangerous indeed.
What food or food combination do you absolutely love that other people find strange?
I'm actually drawn to the black pudding burger as a thing here in Scotland. And not everyone finds the addition of black pudding to anything an attractive option. But
I can understand why that would be. Yeah. Huh. Well, I'll have to tell my husband about that. He loves black pudding. Okay, we've talked a lot about Satan and death and the devil. So, Phil, if Satan had a soundtrack, what song would be on repeat in hell?
oh gosh, I suppose it depends whether we're imagining kind of Satan wanting to enjoy the music that he plays himself, or whether he just wants to torment those who are with him.
Wait, are those mutually exclusive?
Probably. Well, no, but they might be different. Let's go with the second, assuming that the devil's only interest is the sheer torment of those who are there. I would think a kind of endless Muzak versions of 1980s tunes would probably be the music best designed to engender the kind of suffering that the devil would have an interest in.
Wait. So just to be clear, listeners, I think what Phil is saying is that the hold music for most call centers
yes,
is Satan's soundtrack.
I think that's pretty much right.
It is a manifestation of sin, death, and the devil.
Yeah. There are anti-parables of the kingdom to be found, and that may well be one of them.
Okay. What's something you wish was illegal?
Something I wish were illegal. Gosh. I'm going to pass on that. I'm not. I can't conjure anything.
Okay.
At the minute, that's disappointing. I'm sorry.
Well, it'll be something you can think about. Maybe the next time you're on hold at a call center.
I'll imagine. In fact, perhaps being put on hold at a call center might well be the kind of thing that might
There's sanctions. It's like a civil penalty.
Exactly.
Okay. This is our two final questions in OnScript are they're pretty standard if you've listened before. And you can name names for the first one, and you don't have to name names for the second one, and either way is fine. So the first question that we always ask at the end of an interview is, what is the most important work in theology or biblical studies in the past 50 years?
Gosh, I mean, there are lots of candidates, aren't there, for that kind of acclamation. I think for me, if I could put it like this, I would like to suggest, and we haven't talked about this in the context of this particular discussion, but I think the work that's gone into producing the Dietrich Bonhoeffer works, the critical edition of the Bonhoeffer works, I think that is one of the real theological publishing achievements in the realm of theology in the last 50 years, to be sure. The production of that project, vast as it is, and the importance of those texts for the ongoing discussion, reception, and responsible discussion and reception of Bonhoeffer, I think, is immense. And their almost simultaneous rendering in English also, I think, has been a game changer. So that would be one thing that I think I might pick out.
And what is one idea in theology that you think needs to go the way of the dodo bird, that needs to become extinct and die?
Gosh. There are all kinds of ways in which one might think about participation that I might like to think would pass away. That's a category that can mean a whole lot of things, but there's some extraordinarily interesting debate about the value or the limitations of that way of thinking, and I getting that right would be an achievement. And if we got that right, there'd be a lot that we would have to set aside. Okay. So let me offer that as a thought. Okay.
Well, friends, that's all the time we have for today. We've been chatting with Philip Ziegler about his book Militant Grace, which you can purchase on Amazon, and it's even better if you click on on our Amazon link on the OnScript page, because the Amazon gives us a tiny percentage of the sale, which helps support the ongoing work of OnScript. So thanks for listening. Thanks, Phil, for being with us today. And we'll see you next time.
You've been listening to OnScript, delectable conversations on scripture and theology. If this episode has brought you inner peace or lit your biblical fire, please consider a small donation of just $2 or $5 per month. Information on how to donate can be found at onscript.study/donate.